Well, we're here for our communion service here this morning, and I want to start by reminding you of a story that takes place in Luke chapter 10. You don't need to turn there, but I'll just remind you of this story. So Jesus is going from village to village, and he gets to a place and he encounters these two sisters, and their names are Mary and Martha. And I don't know if it was open homes for them at that time, but they invite Jesus to their house for a meal. And so Jesus goes along to their place, and it's very interesting in the story, the contrast between Martha and Mary. Martha was the one who actually invited Jesus to their house, and as you read the story, you get this sense that when Jesus turns up, Martha sort of has a bit of a moment of panic, and she starts busily trying to get everything ready for Jesus. Maybe she's sweeping the house, preparing food, and she's busy, 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 busy. But then Mary, on the other hand, the other sister, she goes and she sits in the room where Jesus is sitting, and she just simply sits at the feet of Jesus, listening to his words and contemplating the things that Jesus is saying. And then Martha, she's walking by and she sees her sister doing this and has this sort of this indignation sort of come upon her, and Jesus, why are you allowing me to do all this work while my lazy sister here is just sitting at your feet listening to you? And Jesus politely kind of rebukes Martha and says, what Mary is doing here is really the more important of these two things. And I think one of the lessons that we can learn from this story is that often as in life, especially as followers of Jesus, we can find ourselves very busy doing things. Busy with just our life things, busy with work, busy with families, even in church life, busy putting programs together, busy being deacons and deaconesses and all those types of things. But I think the lesson that Jesus has for us is that we have to take time out simply to pause and to contemplate Jesus, to contemplate who he is, what he has done for us, and what he continues to do for us today, at the moment and into the future. And so today, as we celebrate communion, I think the reason that Jesus has asked us to do this, and do this from time to time throughout our Christian experience, is because he's given us the gift of this service here, this symbolic service of communion. He's given this to us as a gift to remind us to take that time out to pause from our busy lives, and to simply reflect on the most important theme, and that is of Jesus and his sacrifice for us upon the cross. For those who are visitors here today, if you're a visitor here for the first time, you've never been to a communion service, you might be thinking, well, what is this all about? What is this communion service that he keeps talking about? Well, when we speak about communion, we talk about three symbolic things that we're going to partake in as a church, and that is firstly the foot washing, secondly eating of bread, unleavened bread, and then thirdly drinking the grape juice. And the reason that we do this is because it all goes back to the last meal that Jesus had with his disciples before he went to the cross. And with that last meal that he had, there was a number of the elements of this meal which had a real deep significance attached to them. And as a result, Jesus has asked us to continue to reenact the scenes that were there, reenact this meal, the foot washing, the bread, and the grape juice, as a memorial to continue to put before our minds the great sacrifice that Jesus has for us. And one of the great things about the communion service is that often when, say, if I get up here and preach a sermon, you're listening to that sermon through your ears, and it's sort of just that one sense that is hearing about the gospel message. If I put things on the screen, you've got the sight as well. But when it comes to the communion service, it engages all of our senses. It engages our eyesight as we see the symbols. It engages our touch as you wash those feet. It engages the sense of smell, hopefully not too much when you're washing those feet. And it engages our sense of touch as well. Our sense of taste as we eat the bread and we drink the grape juice. And Jesus wants us to have this sensory experience as we immerse ourselves in that sacrifice that Jesus has done for us. Now today, there's a whole bunch of different aspects of Jesus that we remember when we celebrate communion. But the one I really want to impress upon your minds today is Jesus as a servant. Okay, Jesus as servant. Now, when we talk about servant, what actually is a servant? Well, I looked up the dictionary this week, and in the Oxford English Dictionary, it defines a servant like this. A servant is simply a person who performs duties for others. Okay, pretty simple definition there. And I was talking about how we always find ourselves busy doing this and that, and we're all performing duties throughout our week, but it becomes an act of service when it is done primarily not just for ourselves, but it is done for others. And so when we talk about Jesus as a servant, we're talking about all the different things that he was doing, that those things were not just for himself, but they were for the benefit of others, and specifically they were the benefits for you and for me. Now, I want to read to you Philippians chapter 2 and verse 3 to 4. And we'll read a few more verses after this as well. We're going to spend a bit of time in this passage because this really, for me, unpacks how Jesus was a servant for us. And also how, because of this, God wants us to be a servant to those around us as well. It says in verse 3, "Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves." Is that an easy thing to do? Okay, in life, we're always trying to consider ourselves as being the one who's more significant. But here it's saying, as a general rule, in your relationships, with your interactions with others, don't do it out of selfish ambition. Don't perform the things you do from day to day, from week to week, out of trying to build yourself up. But as you're doing it, consider the people around you as actually being of greater significance than yourself. And then it says, "Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others." So here we see this great call to servanthood, the call for every follower of Jesus to be a servant of others, a servant of God, and in everything that you do. Verse 5 says, "Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant." So the reason we are called to be a servant is because of the way that Jesus has served us, first and foremost. And I love here in this verse how it describes Jesus being having equality with God. Other translations, or even in there it says, "in the form of God." He is God. Jesus was God. And when I read that, I picture Jesus prior to the incarnation, prior to him coming to this earth as a baby, there in heaven, seated in the place of the highest position, the angels surrounding him, worshiping him. He had everything at his disposal, all power, all popularity, all praise. He had everything. And yet it says he took upon himself the form of a servant. He emptied himself of all those privileges of being God. Now, throughout history, there's been lots of servants. But usually when a servant is a servant, number one, it's because there's someone of greater power than them that's making them be a servant, whether it's a king or a master of some sort. And so they're a servant, but they're being forced to be a servant. Other times people might assume the role of a servant because maybe there's some sort of monetary reward that's found in that as well. But the awesome thing about Jesus is that he was actually the one in the highest position. No one had greater power than him. No one was able to subject him to servanthood, but he stepped into that role willingly. And secondly, he had everything that was his. He's the owner of everything. There's no reward that can be given to Jesus. So when Jesus serves, it is the most purest form of servanthood that you can possibly imagine, because he's in the highest position, he has everything, and yet he still willingly steps down to serve us. So how did he serve? Well, it goes on to say, so the last sentence phrase there said, "by taking the form of a servant," and it says, "being born in the likeness of men. And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even the death on a cross." So here we see the two great acts of service that Jesus performed. Number one was the incarnation, that Jesus left heaven to be born as a human being. And number two, his death upon the cross. I've got here a picture of me holding a little baby. So some of you would remember Pastor Marty, one of my good mates, came and preached for us last year. He's actually coming to preach next weekend. So if you're going to be here next week, he's going to be here. And during Big Camp this year, he had a little baby daughter, Johanna. And on my way home, I got to drop by their place and go and meet Johanna for the first time. And I remember I walked into the door of Marty and Tanae's house, and Marty literally just went, boom, have this baby. So I was like, oh, I'm not usually very good at holding babies and things like that. So holding this baby, and they were sort of showing me what to do. And I sat there, and for the next 45 minutes, that baby literally did like absolutely nothing. Okay, just sat there, did a few like these squirmy things, and then eventually started crying, and then I was like, gave the baby back to Tanae. But I think it's just the most profound thought to think that Jesus, the one from that highest position in heaven, would leave all of that to be one of these little babies. Okay, a little baby that is so helpless. Imagine Jesus, all he can do is just doing these little squiggly, wiggly things, crying. Just what an incredible contrast from where he was to where he lowered himself to. Jesus is the greatest example of a servant. And in fact, because Jesus had left his place in heaven to be a child, before he even said one word, before he even took one step, before he performed one action, he was already the greatest servant that the universe had ever and would ever see. But that act of service was soon to be surpassed by the unfathomable act of service that he would perform upon the cross. And on the cross, we see Jesus empty himself to the next level on our behalf. I want you to picture Jesus there on the cross. He's hanging, he's naked, he's beaten, he's wounded, and he's bleeding. The nails are through his hands and through his feet. He's struggling to breathe. And if the physical pain wasn't enough, there's the weight of the sins of the world pressing down upon his shoulders. And this is here as a result of betrayal, a result of being abandoned by his friends. And there's people walking around beneath him, mocking him, making fun of him. And it's this terrible scene. And I'd like to suggest that this is the greatest act of service that has ever been performed and that could ever be performed. But the reason it was an act of service was not just the fact that Jesus did all of these things, but it was because Jesus did all of these things for us. In Isaiah chapter 53 and verse 3, it says this: "He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain, like one from whom people hide their faces. He was despised, and we held him in low esteem." What a poetic portrayal of Jesus hanging there upon the cross, written many years before he actually died upon the cross. Isaiah goes on to say, "Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed." So the fact that this was the greatest act of service was not just because he was pierced, but because that piercing was for our transgressions. It was not just that he was crushed, but it was because that crushing was for our sins. It was not just because he was punished, but it was because that was the punishment that we deserved, and his wounds were the things that made us have an opportunity to be healed. And so Jesus, I present to you today as the greatest servant who ever lived and whoever will live. But he did all of those things, his incarnation and his death upon the cross, for us. Okay, so I want to take your minds back to the Last Supper there. So Jesus is having his last meal with his disciples. And just think about it. He's the man who was God, who abandoned heaven to come to earth, to give everything for these disciples and for us and for all of humanity. Everything he had done during his life was this reckless giving of himself, this reckless act of service. And now Jesus is in the shadow of the cross. And in Jerusalem at that time, people had been preparing for the Passover, and every aspect of that Passover was just impressing upon the mind of Jesus the great sacrifice that he would soon perform. And Jesus now looks around the room and he sees his disciples. He's ready to serve them. He's ready to walk that cruel path of crucifixion. But there's something that's not right in the room there on that day. Something is out of place. And this thing that is out of place is in the heart of the disciples. For 3 years, Jesus has lived with them, walked with them. They've been listening to him. They've watched him perform these miracles, these acts of compassion, and yet they still don't get it. They still don't get what Jesus is all about. Jesus is about to go to the cross to die for them. And you know what they're thinking about? In Luke chapter 22, verse 24, which is, if you look at the verses before and after, this is taking place in the time of the Last Supper there. It says, a dispute also arose among them as to which of them was to be regarded as the greatest. Can you imagine how much it would have grieved Jesus? He's about to lay down his life. If you think of where he's come from and where he's going, and he's about to do that, and the disciples are worried about who's going to go in the other direction, who can be the greatest amongst them. How would Jesus impress upon their minds this important lesson of servanthood? And so they're reclining there around the table, and on this day, there's two things going on in their minds. Number one, they're thinking about who is the greatest. But number two, there's another thing that they're all keenly aware of that's in the room. This is what they're also thinking about. Dirty feet. Okay? And if you think about in the time of Jesus, walking around those dusty streets in sandals, it wouldn't take very long for your feet to get very dirty. And in the time of Jesus, it was actually the role of the servant, the person the lowest of the position of people in such a setting, who would take the role of washing everyone's feet. However, on this night, no preparation had been made for a servant to do that. They had the water there, the bowl there, the towel there. Everything had been ready except for someone to actually do the washing of the feet. Now, this is a real dilemma for the disciples, because if they take the role of washing someone else's feet, they are admitting defeat and saying, I am the least in this room. And they're fighting over who's going to be the greatest. And so they're all looking around. It's like this awkward thing that everyone's aware of. No one is speaking about waiting. Who will be the person who will take this role? And I think Peter and John must have been even more aware of this, because it was their job to prepare for that meal that evening. And yet they were the ones who've forgotten to do this preparation. Will they take this role or not? What is going to take place? And as the disciples are thinking about this, they look up and they see Jesus rise to his feet. What the disciples saw as an embarrassing situation, Jesus saw as an opportunity for service. He gets up, he lays his outer garments aside, he ties a towel around his waist, he pours the water into the bowl, and he takes the dress of literally a dress of a servant. And one by one, he goes around and begins to wash the feet of his disciples. You can imagine the shock they would have had, the horror possibly they would have had as well, that Jesus, their master, would assume the role of a servant. But the lesson that Jesus had for them on that night is the same lesson that he has for us as well. When he gets up, it says in John 13, verse 12 to 15, when he'd washed their feet, he put on his outer garments and resumed his place. He said to them, do you understand what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you also should do just as I have done to you. So we're going to now partake in the washing of each other's feet. And so we'll pair up for this. If you're a visitor, just go to one of the rooms, and we'll make sure that everyone who's there in the rooms has someone to pair up with. Again, if you don't feel comfortable, you feel free to stay in here in the room, but you're welcome to come and join us there for the foot washing. And as we wash one another's feet, I want you to take this as a time of contemplation, to pause and simply think of the way in which Jesus has served us. He served us through the incarnation. His life was a life of service, and especially on the cross, was the greatest act of service. All those things that he did for us. And as you reflect on that, I encourage you to think about how he wants us to imitate that service as well. We've already talked about how the cross was the greatest act of service that the world has ever seen. But I want to reflect on now why that was an act of service, how the cross was actually done for us. And cast your minds back to the Garden of Eden. God had created everything, and after everything he created, he said it was good, it was good, it was good, it was good. And then finally, as he makes man and he makes woman, he looks at it all and he says, it is very good. So everything that Adam and Eve experienced up to this point was just bliss, paradise, fantastic, beautiful, wonderful, loving, every other positive word that you could possibly put onto that as well. It was all very good. But there was that tree in the middle of the Garden of Eden called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And God had said that if you eat from that fruit, then you would experience not just a knowledge of good, but this immersive, experiential knowledge of evil as well. And you would be familiar, I'm sure, with the story. Satan works with the snake and convinces Eve to partake of that fruit. And then she gives it to Adam, who eats it as well. And sin enters into the human race. But the thing that really stands out to me as I read through that story is how quickly the effects of sin begin to devastate us as a human race. I want to just put up on the board 7 things that immediately happen when sin enters into the world. So firstly, when you read through in Genesis there, it says they realized that they were naked. Okay? And so they went and tried to make clothes out of fig leaves for themselves. The second thing that they experience is shame and fear. Jesus comes walking in the garden. Adam, where are you? Eve, where are you? And they're like, whoomp, behind the bushes and embarrassed, shameful, and full of fear. Then eventually they come out and they stand before Jesus, and Jesus says, Adam, have you eaten this fruit? And Adam says, the woman gave it to me. And they start accusing one another. Okay, so there's these accusations that are being thrown around. Fourthly, we see that with these accusations, there's a breakdown in the human relationships. Adam and Eve, which had this beautiful relationship before that, suddenly are pointing fingers at each other, and Adam's just thrown her in front of the bus, as they say. Okay, it's her fault. Then we see there's the thorns. Okay, the evil enters into creation itself. The ground is going to be hard to work. There's the thorns and the thistles. And it's interesting just the separation that happens between Adam and Eve and God right there from the very beginning. God comes exactly it seems exactly as he had beforehand. Adam, Eve, where are you? Adam and Eve are hiding behind the bushes. There's been this fracture in not just the human relationships, but also the human-God relationship as well. And it's the very next chapter, in chapter 4, that we see that Cain, their son, murders their other son, and we see death comes into the human race through this very ugly, ugly, ugly way. And so we see that just from that one sin, the results from that have been devastating, and we continue to experience the devastation of those results today. Now, Jesus, when he took sin upon himself on the cross, he experienced the full results of sin and the full punishment, and he experienced sin full grown. And I find it interesting, if we look at these 7 things that Adam and Eve experienced right there from the beginning, Jesus, in the events surrounding the cross, experienced every single one of these as well. Nakedness, he hung there naked upon the cross. Shame and fear, we just have to think of Jesus there in the Garden of Gethsemane, so stressed by the situation and the weight of the sin that his sweat is like drops of blood. Accusations, he's dragged before this court and that court, and people are pointing all these false accusations at Jesus. Broken relationships, he's betrayed, he's abandoned. The nation that he came there that was supposed to welcome him organizes his murder, his execution, and then the people he's wanting to save are the very ones that are nailing him to that cross. Thorns, Jesus wears them upon his head. Separation from God, Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And ultimately, Jesus is murdered there upon the cross. The full experience of sin is unleashed upon Jesus. And in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 21, it says, God made him who had no sin. Jesus was the perfect lamb. He never did anything wrong. But God made him who had no sin to be sin for us. There's those two words, remember? A servant is someone who performs duties for other people. Jesus did this for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. We may be made right and experience what Jesus deserves, which is life and eternal life. So as we partake of the bread and the grape juice now, I just want you to reflect on Jesus serving you, as you're serving you by dying upon the cross. And as that bread is broken, we think of Jesus' body that was broken on the cross. And as that the grape juice is poured out, we think of Jesus' blood which was poured out for us.